Congressman Andy Barr, it's good to see you, sir.
Renee, great to be with you.
I know you're going full steam ahead and you're in the district this week. That's probably seeming like a vacation, huh?
Well, it's busy here too, but
right.
Certainly it's a nice reprieve from the busy pace in Washington. Good to be home with our constituents and with family.
Well, it's good to have you home. I know your family is saying the same. I want to start by some unfortunate events that have happened over the last 48 hours in Kentucky. Of course, eastern Kentucky continues to get battered by these storms, and once again, many of those same counties have fallen victim to floods in that area. We've heard officials on both sides of the aisle praise the work that FEMA is doing to help in these disastrous times. We know that the Trump administration is reshaping, looking to downsize government, and is also looking at FEMA. And the Department of Government Efficiency has called FEMA ineffective and inefficient. How do you see FEMA's role, in particular at a time right now here in Kentucky when so many are relying on that federal assistance? What do you think the role of FEMA should be?
Well, first of all, our thoughts and prayers go to those families in eastern Kentucky who have lost loved ones. The count is 9 fatalities so far, but loss of property as well. And we've seen that here in central Kentucky not too long ago in Estill and Powell County, where we've seen terrible flooding that impacts our communities. And Nicholas County had a terrible flood a few years back. So FEMA obviously has a role to play, but we saw some really unfortunate incompetency and outright malfeasance in FEMA's response to the hurricane that hit North Carolina, western North Carolina. Obviously, the California wildfires is a different issue as well because of some things that we could do differently in terms of forest management and prevention of forest fires. But FEMA needs to be modernized. FEMA needs to be reformed. And I welcome the Department of Government Efficiency taking a searching review of that agency and how it responds. I'll give you an example of how FEMA did not adequately respond in our own district a few years back. We had a terrible flood in Carlisle in Nicholas County. And there was a hurricane in Louisiana, and there were a lot of manufactured homes, emergency housing, shelter, that was being shipped right through Nicholas County on its way to New Orleans, but not stopping there. And FEMA was telling me, and I went all the way to the top. I went to the administrator. This is during the Biden administration. I asked, why can't we get assistance and rapid assistance to the people of Nicholas County? And there was 90 some odd homes totally destroyed. And the answer was, it's too small of a community. Well, that was a very unsatisfying response. And we saw that in western North Carolina, where you even had the politicization of the delivery of assistance, where FEMA officials were skipping over homes with Trump Vance signs in the front yard. That kind of thing is ridiculous. You know, there are Democrats who suffer in tragedies like this. There are Republicans who suffer in natural disasters like this. Politics should stay out of it. We should just have competent delivery of services. So we do need to reform FEMA. We can make it more lean, but we need to make it respond. And we shouldn't discriminate against communities just because they're rural, in the mountains, or they have a smaller population. Well,
even Governor Beshear praised President Trump for how quickly he made the federal disaster declaration for Kentucky to, of course, get more needed assistance. You still feel, though, that there is some politicization of FEMA from previous administrations, and that's why it needs to be gutted. What do you think needs to happen? Does it need to be scratched and rebuilt, or just tweaked?
Well, Congressman Edwards, who represents western North Carolina, he told us about the politicization of FEMA's efforts. Frankly, not just the politicization, but the slow glacial pace of the response that required the private sector, frankly, to respond much more effectively than FEMA. So we need to reevaluate FEMA. Obviously, FEMA requires resources from the taxpayer to respond in these emergencies. And I've voted for disaster assistance in the past, but we need a better, more efficient, effective delivery system. I actually worked with former Congressman Katko from New York a few years back, who was chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. Actually, at the time, I think he was the ranking member. We were in the minority. But we worked with Democrats to pass a bill that would make these smaller communities eligible for assistance. Mm-hmm. And I've told the mayor of Carlisle and the county judge executive in Nicholas County that while that tragedy didn't help them, that because they were ineligible at the time, that episode inspired legislation that will hopefully help smaller communities in the future be eligible for that FEMA assistance going forward.
Right. So for those who are watching who are near those areas and have people they're concerned about in those areas who are flood ridden right now, they shouldn't fear that FEMA will go away.
No, they shouldn't. And in fact, we anticipate that in the appropriations bill that is coming up in March, that there will be some supplemental disaster assistance for Western North Carolina, for California, and I will be working very hard to make sure that Kentucky gets help, and so will Congressman Rogers as well, because it's his district.
That's right. That's right. I want to take a shift and talk a little bit more, and then I want to get to some of your priorities. There's been a lot in the news made of Elon Musk and him being over the Department of Government Efficiency, which you are a member of a caucus of that of DOGE. And there are some who are concerned about a non-elected being allowed such great latitude to possibly come in and reshape government. Are you comfortable with his role in this administration?
I am. 77 million Americans voted for change. They voted for Donald Trump because they recognize the country's on the wrong track. One of the reasons why the country's on the wrong track is we have a $36 trillion national debt. I pointed this out to the Federal Reserve Chairman the other day in our hearing. We are right now, according to BlackRock, we are issuing $573 billion in Treasury bonds every single week in America. Now think about that. $573 billion in new issuance of treasuries. Now, some of that's maturing, but some of it's new debt issuance because we simply can't cover the bills in this country. We have a $2 trillion deficit annually. We had this huge $5 trillion blowout in spending over the last 4 years, partisan spending mostly after COVID, on top of all of that COVID money. As a result, we're simply in an unsustainable place right now. I mean, put that in perspective. $573 billion a week. That is the entire national debt of Australia. We are issuing in Treasury bonds the debt of Australia every week in America. Of course, the American people welcome a little bit of circumspection when it comes to the way we spend money like drunken sailors in this country. And we had a hearing in the Foreign Affairs Committee the other day, and I pointed out some of the waste coming out of the USAID that Elon Musk has uncovered. Just some of this stuff, it's unbelievable. $2 million to conduct sex change surgeries in Guatemala through a trans-led organization. You have here $31 million to provide U.S. aid employees with resilience, wellness, and work-life balance. Should the taxpayers really be on the hook for that? $500,000 for Indonesian coffee companies to become more climate and gender friendly. We had a grant to Uganda that actually undermined our national security because it was promoting LGBT rights in a very socially conservative culture that pushed the Ugandan people who are fighting terrorists with the United States in Somalia towards a Belt and Road project with the communist Chinese, a $5 billion East African oil pipeline. Now, look, we may disagree as a culture with their preferences when it comes to LGBT rights, but that's not the question. The question is, what is the role of the State Department's diplomacy? What is the role of USAID? And if it undermines our national security by pushing would-be allies to our adversaries and empowering our adversaries, it's not only wasteful spending, it actually undermines our diplomatic and national security objectives. So I think DOGE is very welcome. It's needed. It's needed because we have this huge national debt. It's needed because, frankly, it's counterproductive to our national security objectives. I would just say one other thing. I know that a lot of my Democratic colleagues are concerned about they say it's a constitutional crisis. We have an unelected billionaire who's accessing private personal information of Americans. He has no authority to do this. That's nonsense. Think of DOGE as like a McKinsey or a Booz Allen Hamilton, a management consulting firm that this president, who has the majority support of the American people to cut spending, brought in to do an audit to find out where all the hardworking taxpayers' money is gone. why are we spending so much money? We're spending it on all of this waste that's hurting our national security. And so I think it's welcome that he does this. And just real quick with USAID, Congress did create an independent agency, USAID. But even though Congress created an independent agency, Congress also empowered the president to reorganize that agency from time to time and never rescinded that power from the president. And in that same statute, gave the Secretary of State the authority to direct the administrator of USAID and to set the foreign policy direction and guidance. So the idea that that the Secretary of State cannot pause this aid and the president cannot pause this aid while we look at what is wasteful and what is counterproductive and what is actually good, I think makes sense. And I think they've done this in a very smart way. Secretary Rubio has given a waiver for life-saving food assistance and PEPFAR and other programs that actually are furthering our national interests. But we need to take a look at all this waste, fraud, and abuse.
There are some, though, who feel that if there's a pause that becomes permanent on USAID, that will embolden countries like China to fill in the void where America has been. Do you lend any credence to that argument?
Well, as a member of the East Asia and the Pacific Subcommittee, I recognize that American soft power diplomacy and some foreign assistance can actually play a role in advancing American interests overseas. But when we're giving $122 million to organizations, according to the Middle East Forum, organizations affiliated with radical Islamic terrorist organizations, designated foreign terrorist organizations, when we're giving money to the Taliban from American taxpayers, when we're giving money to terrorists in Yemen and Syria, when we're giving money to Hamas in Gaza that are anti-Semites, is this what American taxpayers should have their hard-earned money go to? I don't think so. And I think this kind of review of wasteful spending is long overdue.
There are some who are puzzled, I'll say, by Congress's seemingly inaction or resistance to act when there are pink slips given to federal employees, shutting down of agencies, and the stopping of funding that's been approved by Congress, part of your duties in Article 1 of the Constitution. Hence your comment about the constitutional crisis. Is there not some concern within the Republican conference that the president, the chief executive officer of this nation, is overextending his authority unchecked and abusing his power unchecked?
Well, no, I don't, because, and I believe that the power of the purse, the appropriations power for Congress is a very important power. That's why I've been trying to get my colleagues to support my legislation called the TABS Act, the Taking Account of Bureaucrats Spending Act. The Dodd-Frank law created this unaccountable agency called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is exempt from the congressional appropriations process, that gets its funding to harass credit providers and small lenders across this country through the Federal Reserve System. So totally outside of the appropriations process. This means that this agency is unaccountable to the American people through the power of the purse. That's what makes our oversight meaningful. So I'm a defender of congressional appropriations authority. But remember, look at, for example, this USAID review, this pause. When we appropriate money to USAID, Congress did not authorize money to go to a drag show in Ecuador. We didn't do that. We gave USAID a pot of money, and we gave them a mission, and we gave them parameters. And they've gone beyond the mission that we gave them. And so the idea that the executive branch would then review how that money is spent is totally constitutional, totally appropriate, and I think long overdue. The American people, they work hard to earn a paycheck and to pay taxes. And this is offensive to a lot of these people. And we have a $2 trillion deficit, even if some of this stuff was worthwhile, and it's certainly not. We just can't afford it anymore.
Yeah. So maybe a scalpel to those questionable expenditures and not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Would that not be a more prudent approach?
Well, I think what you're going to see is a wholesale review of a lot of agencies. USAID is the first, but we're going to I anticipate that the Department of Education, the Social Security Administration, a lot of these agencies will be put under the microscope, appropriately so, to root out the waste, fraud, and abuse. We're being told preliminarily that the Department of Government Efficiency, Elon Musk, and some of his very smart people working for him, looking at systems and processes, are identifying $2 billion, Renee, every year of American taxpayer dollars going from Social Security to individuals without a Social Security number. I mean, this is why Social Security is going bankrupt. And this is why the American people voted for an America First strategy. They don't want checks going to illegal immigrants. They don't want checks going to people who are dead. They want the Social Security system to be solvent so that the people, the taxpayers who actually paid into the system, will know that there's integrity in the program going forward. So, look, I hear the hysteria from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. This is what the American people voted for. We have got to stop spending money we don't have on programs we don't need.
The American people also voted to have eggs come down, gas come down, for their cost of living and their ability to afford a home in a safe neighborhood to be more accessible. Where are those plans? Well,
I think a couple of things. I think the inflation crisis that we've witnessed over the last several years, and as someone with oversight over the economy and the Federal Reserve System and a lot of the regulators, the overspending contributed to the inflation crisis. And so cutting spending is step number one in reducing the cost of living for Americans. And it's a major crisis. And the chairman of the Federal Reserve was in front of us in our committee the other day, and I made the point to him that we have not whipped inflation yet. We're still at 3%, over the 2% target that they have to get to. But job number one for us, I think, is to cut spending, which is very inflationary. The second thing is regulatory relief and producing more energy. The war on energy drove up the cost of everything, because when you have constrained supply of energy, it's a simple supply and demand issue, and that's what drove prices up as well. So the policy of restoring American energy dominance in this country will lower the cost, and cutting red tape, cutting regulations so that we can have cheaper goods and services in this country, I think is key going forward. That's the America First agenda that this administration is pursuing.
And some want a Kentucky First agenda when it comes to bourbon, Congressman.
That's right.
You know very well that the tariff talk by the Trump administration is again causing some concern within bourbon enthusiasts and distillers who remember the 2018 tariffs and the hundreds of millions of dollars that were suffered then. They say they were caught up in a trade war that had nothing to do with whiskey. Are we in for a repeat of that? And what are you going to do to put the brakes on any kind of plans on tariffs?
Yeah, so as the co-chairman of the Congressional Bourbon Caucus, a very bipartisan caucus, I will say, in Congress, it's very important that we give a voice in Washington to the bourbon industry. But I agree with the administration, the new administration, the Trump administration, that unfair trade practices, even from our allies and partners, that's got to end. The American people have been ripped off with some of these unfair trade practices, not just from China, but from Europe and from India and from our allies and partners. And so the policy of reciprocity in trade, I think, makes a whole lot of sense. And so I fully support it. Now, it is true that when the Europeans retaliated against the steel and aluminum tariffs back in 2018, we saw a 20% dip in bourbon exports into the EU, which is our number one export market. It was very alarming for Kentucky distillers to see the Canadians pull those Kentucky bourbon products off of the shelves when we were negotiating on, when the administration was negotiating on border security just a few weeks ago. But at the end of the day, I think, and we will continue to make sure we advocate for extricating spirits from that, because it is true that a lot of spirits companies have products that are in the United States only and products in Europe, some products in Mexico, tequila, for example. But at the end of the day, I think using the power of tariffs as a negotiating tool, not as a policy, not as a perpetual policy, but as a negotiating tool, has extraordinary opportunity to open markets for Kentucky bourbon. And the best example is what just happened. So I recently met with the Indian ambassador to the United States, Mr. Quatra, and I also met with the incoming Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, who I've developed a relationship over the last several years. And Secretary Lutnick heard us. He heard about the concerns about retaliatory tariffs from the European Union coming back in March. The Indian ambassador heard us when we objected to the fact that India, the largest market in the world, 1.4 billion consumers, has 150% tariffs. Now you think about that. Europe is threatening 25% tariffs. India, the largest market on planet Earth, 1.4 billion people, they have 150% tariffs on our bourbon whiskey exports. And so we were able to work with the administration, work with Prime Minister Modi's administration and the Indian embassy, and they just announced, because of our efforts, a lowering of that from 150 to 100. Now, I told the Indian ambassador, I said, thank you, but we got more to do. We got to bring that down. But if you can imagine the power of what this administration is doing in terms of opening up new markets, and as one distiller in Garrett County told me, who's an Indian American, he said, the sweet corn-based Kentucky bourbon fits perfectly with the spicy Indian palate. And just that 50% lowering of that tariff creates massive opportunities for American whiskey to outcompete the legacy Scotch, which is blended down and is not very good and not popular in India. So I really think at the end of the day, yes, there could be some short-term disruption with these tariffs, but in the long run, getting to greater market access, more reciprocity will be very good for the bourbon industry.
Has there been any action to date since President Trump has reclaimed the White House that you disagree with?
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, I don't always agree with everything. What I would like for the administration to focus on these tariffs with bourbon is to extricate American spirits from this aluminum conversation. They're trying to do that. And what Secretary Lutnick told me he was going to do is to focus on an all of America approach as opposed to just focus on bourbon or one particular product's corn, soybeans, Harley-Davidsons, whatever it is. I understand that because the president's constituency is the entire United States. My constituency is Kentucky. So I have a particular soft spot, pain point for bourbon. So we're just working through that together to make sure that we can advocate for Kentucky in the context of the larger tariff conversation.
Do you believe that President Trump has the most qualified, capable cabinet and appointees in his circle?
I'll tell you what, I've been so impressed with his cabinet. And in particular, I've been impressed with Scott Bessent, the new Treasury Secretary. Howard Lutnick and I have obviously worked together on this trade issue and economic issues. Scott Bessent, I've met with, and actually I met with him before he was confirmed and before the election even. And what he said to me is, we're going to reprivatize the American economy. We're going to make the American banking system the envy of the world. We're going to make the American financial system competitive again. And I look forward to working with him on that deregulatory agenda. I get it. There are other nominees that are more controversial than Mr. Bessent. But I think this president, with 77 million Americans voting for this America First agenda, voting overwhelmingly for change, recognizing in those polls that came out, the exit polls on Election Day, that Americans overwhelmingly said that the country's on the wrong track. This president deserves the cabinet of his choosing.
So let's talk about you and what we've been reading of late about will you or won't you run for U.S. Senate in 2026? What say you, sir?
Well, as I've said, we're doing a lot of listening and deliberation and discernment.
Listening to whom?
Listening to, number one, my family. They're
probably
really
the biggest constituent.
They're the number one constituent.
Right.
But, you know, my constituents in central Kentucky who I've represented and served over these last 12, now 13 years, who, you know, I've developed a really strong, close relationship with these people. Democrats, independents, and Republicans. And, you know, one thing I look at is, how am I doing with Democrats and independents? And, you know, we get our report card into Congress every 2 years. Well, you know,
or how have you done?
There were over 12,000 citizens of Lexington, Kentucky, who voted for Kamala Harris and me in Lexington. I must be doing something right. I don't know if it's me. I think it's probably my staff. They're doing a lot of great work.
But Fayette County.
That's Fayette County.
Was different in the in the last election.
Yeah, no, I exactly. But the point is, I don't see that as a bad thing. I see that as a positive, that I'm able to appeal across party lines. And if you're a Republican in Kentucky and you want to win and you want to retain this seat in the United States Senate, and you want an America First conservative, you want someone who's going to win. And my view is the only way a Democrat can win statewide in Kentucky is to do it the way Governor Beshear did it and win the 6th district, the Central Kentucky district. The fact that we've been able to lock down this purple swing district over and over again showcases not only that we're in step with the values of the people of Kentucky, but also that we have a record of success, a record of competency, a record of constituent service, of delivering for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Enough so that Democrats and independents will cross over and vote for me and my team.
So this is a yes.
So it is a lot of encouragement. And I felt called to represent the Central Kentucky district over these last 10 years. It has been the privilege of my lifetime to get a chance to go and fight for these families and fight for the people at Toyota and fight for the researchers at the University of Kentucky and fight for the bourbon industry and fight for our farmers, and fight for the horse, our signature horse industry. And I think we've done a pretty good job. I am interested in taking that statewide because I love Kentucky. I love the people of Kentucky, and I'm getting a lot of green lights.
Okay, even if U.S. Senator Mitch McConnell stays in?
Yeah, I think the people of Kentucky deserve, number one, a U.S. senator that supports this president, and number two...
And Mitch McConnell, you think, does not?
Well, in some cases he does. In some cases he doesn't. I'm my own man. People have often said, are you a Rand Paul Republican or a Mitch McConnell Republican? I'm an Andy Barr Republican. What does that mean? I'm an America First conservative. I believe in limited government, fiscal responsibility, and free enterprise. I believe in a strong national defense. And I believe in Kentucky, most of all. I believe in Kentucky. And I think Kentucky has enormous potential. And I've got a lot of ideas about that. And I've got a vision for making Kentucky great again, just like we're trying to make America great again. So have we made a decision yet? No. But I'm listening, and I'm getting a lot of encouragement, and I just am grateful for that.
Are you getting any kind of telepathic signals from Senator McConnell that he is going to step aside? Or have you had any conversations with him about his intentions for 2026?
Well, I think he's going to have to make that decision on his own. We're going to make our decision on our own as well, on our own timeline, in consultation, number one, with my family.
Yeah.
But I also take it very seriously that a lot of Kentuckians across the Commonwealth, both here in Central Kentucky and elsewhere, have said, it's time. It's time. We want you to run. So I'm taking that to heart.
I know that you have seen an ad by Club for Growth, a conservative super PAC that has been built by Jeff Yaz, who is a friend or a supporter of Rand Paul, who you just mentioned. And that ad calls you out on your votes to raise the debt ceiling multiple times since you've been in Congress for 12 years, accuses you of supporting woke Wall Street banks. Your response to that, and what does that say about your conservative bona fides, that this other conservative is calling you out in such a manner?
Well, I don't think they are conservative. In fact, this is the same group that attacked President Donald Trump. And the fact of the matter is, over the last 4 years, especially during the term of Joe Biden, I voted against $5 trillion in spending, voted for the Limit, Save, and Grow Act, and voted against debt limits when there was a clean debt limit and there was no reform. The only time that I vote for debt limits is when there is reform attached to it. Obviously, we can't default. That'll actually cost our economy more. But what I have said is, when we do vote to raise the debt limit because of overspending in the past and to avoid a default, which would be a disaster for our economy, we should pair it with reform, and especially mandatory spending reform. And so that's what I've done. And I've voted over and over and over again to cut spending, and my record is clear on that. I am a fiscal conservative. That's why I support the Department of Government Efficiency and why I'm fighting all of this waste, fraud, and abuse right now. But look, I think it says a lot that I haven't even declared my candidacy, and there's an outside group who's attacking me.
Right.
They must be worried about something.
So when do you have to do it? I mean, we're in 2025. We're not that far in, but we know that the election cycles start pretty early these days, right? In order for you to get the fundraising you need, we can imagine that this will be a really expensive race, depending on who else gets in. We've heard names like Nate Morris. We've heard Daniel Cameron. There could be others out there that have not been named. You're going to try to clear the field?
Well, look, I mean, everybody has to make their own decision. And I like competition. Competition's a good thing. We're Republicans. Republicans believe in a free enterprise and capitalism requires competition. Iron sharpens iron. It makes us better. It makes us more effective.
A competitive primary you welcome.
I welcome that. I have gone through competitive primaries and I've won competitive primaries. I've gone through competitive general elections and I've won competitive general elections. And I would argue that unlike others who have run and lost badly, that I am battle tested like no other Republican. I've been through the battles, defeating an incumbent Democrat and then running against $20 million, the most well-funded challenger in America in Amy McGrath, and holding on to the seat in the middle of a blue wave. That should tell Republicans around the state who is best capable of winning and keeping this seat for conservatives and for this agenda of President Donald Trump. And I support this agenda. I'm America First conservative, and I just want to make sure that we can accomplish all of the promise of this time in our country.
I've kept you entirely too long, but I do have one question to go back to University of Kentucky, because we know that University of Kentucky is really concerned about their research dollars. They have that NIH designation. They do a lot of cancer research and other areas of medical advancement. I'm sure you've had conversations with President Capilouto about this and others within the administration there at UK. What are you telling them about this?
Well, not all spending is created equal, right? When I look at spending, federal spending, I want to know, is this going to deliver a return on investment for the taxpayer? You know, some of this stuff at USAID clearly does not. In fact, it's counterproductive. It undermines our national security. Medical research at the Comprehensive National Cancer Institute at the University of Kentucky, Sanders Brown Center on Aging, that has a return on investment. It can save lives. So, yeah, I do support spending where it makes sense. But we have to live within our means. And I don't think those two objectives are mutually exclusive. And I've always approached that. Now, it's funny, you mentioned that attack ad. One of the things they try to allege is that I'm supporting some kind of DEI initiative. You know what they're talking about, Renee? They're talking about a pretty modest grant that I was able to secure for an academy at William Wells Brown Elementary for 3-year-olds. Now, why would I do that? These are underprivileged kids with parents who are struggling with childcare to go to work. Now, we're Republicans. We believe in self-sufficiency. We believe in work. I believe in that grant. You can call it DEI all you want. It's a good grant because it's going to help these parents have a safe place for their kids to prepare them early childhood education before they go to William Wells Brown, one of the most difficult elementary schools in a distressed neighborhood in our community. And I stand by that grant 100% because guess what? It's going to allow those parents to know and have the peace of mind those kids are safe, they're getting an education, and they can go to work. That makes them taxpayers. That makes those kids future citizens with a chance. We're for upward mobility. We're the Republican Party. We're for the American dream. If you want to criticize me for working to enable the American dream, then have at it. But I will defend that grant every day of the week.
Have we gotten too far with the woke isms and the woke language and the woke lexicons? Is there any turning back from that to the point you just raised? Because that could be an example of many of considered woke opportunities that are to help advance upward mobility, and the Republican Party, as you say, being about the party of opportunity, not of outcomes, but of opportunity.
Right. Upward mobility, the American dream. That's what I'm about. I believe in the American dream. Now, when you have policies that prioritize politics over outcomes, or you have policies that prioritize the politicization of banks or education or other institutions in society as opposed to excellence, that's when I have a problem with it. There's so much in our culture and in our society that's politicized. And I think there's a lot of people who are sick of it. I think what they want is results. They want success. So whether it's your 401k, you know, you could be a Democrat, you could be a Republican, you could be an independent, but what do you want? You want retirement security. Why should we have politics dictate how your assets are allocated? We should have returns, prioritize that. That's why I fought environmental, social, and governance investing. Why should we let politics interfere with early childhood education where it gives parents a chance to go to work and become taxpayers? Why should we criticize that? So, you know, I think let's depoliticize a lot of this stuff and let's focus on excellence, results, and the American dream.
Congressman Andy Barr, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for your indulgence of time.
Thanks so much.